study that we're doing, and of course, the great presenters and witnesses that we have today. So it's my pleasure to call this meeting to order and welcome all of you to meeting number 10 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Transport, Infrastructure, and Communities. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of September 23rd, 2020. The proceedings will be made available via the House of Commons website, so you are aware the webcast will always show the person speaking rather than the entirety of the committee. To ensure an orderly meeting, I would like to outline a few rules to follow. Members and witnesses may speak in the official language of their choice. Interpretation services are available for this meeting. You have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor, English, or French. For members participating in person, proceed as you usually would when the whole committee is meeting in person in the committee room. Keep in mind the directives from the Board of Internal Economy regarding masking and health protocols. Before speaking, please wait until I recognize you by name. If you are on video conference, please click on the microphone icon to unmute yourself. Those in the room, your microphone will be controlled as normal by the proceedings and the verification officer. A reminder that all comments by members and witnesses should be addressed to the chair. When you are not speaking, your mic should be on mute. With regard to a speaking list, as always, the committee clerk and I will do our best to maintain the order of speaking for all members, whether it be participating virtually or in person, albeit we do have the speakers list in front of us. Therefore, pursuant to Standing Order 1082, the committee is today meeting to continue its study on the impact of COVID-19 on the aviation sector. I would like to welcome our witnesses here today. I've been told beforehand that there has been some agreement by the witnesses of which the order to speak in. We do have today from Air North, Mr. Joseph Sparling, the President. Air Passenger Rights, Mr. Gabor Lucas, President. Canadian Automobile Association, Ian Jack, Vice President, Public Affairs, and Jason Kerr, Senior Director, Government Relations. We have Late Flight Claim Canada Incorporated, Mr. Jacob Charbonneau, President and Chief Executive Officer. Option Consumateur, Sylvie D. Bellafiole, Lawyer, Budget and Legal Advisor. Public Interest Advocacy Center, John Lawford, Executive Director and General Counsel. To all of you, welcome. And the order that I was given prior to the meeting, of which you all agreed upon, I assume, is the way it was communicating to me, would be Mr. or Dr. Gabor Lucas, would be the Air Passenger Rights, would be the first to speak, followed by Sylvie, John, Ian, Joseph, and Jacob. With that, we'll start off with Dr. Lucas for 5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Mr. Chair, honorable members, thank you for the privilege to appear here today. Air Passenger Rights is Canada's independent, non-profit organization of volunteers devoted to empowering travelers. We accept no government or business funding, and we have no business interest in the travel industry. We speak for passengers whom we help daily in their struggle to enforce their rights. Last time we testified before this committee, we cautioned that the Canadian Transportation Agency had lost its independence and its consumer protection activities had been compromised. The COVID-19 pandemic has confirmed the magnitude of these anomalies. Since March, we have witnessed an unprecedented assault on passengers' private property and the collapse of consumer protection in Canada. Airlines whose revenues were decimated by the pandemic have helped themselves to passengers' money and pocketed airfares that were paid in advance without providing any services in return. During the pandemic, airlines have perfected the scheme. They kept selling tickets just to cancel flights at the last minute and keep passengers' money. For instance, between September 25th and October 31st, Air Canada canceled about 75% of its flights scheduled for November. Let's look at the numbers. 3,870,000 affected passengers. It is a conservative estimate for the number of outstanding tickets on Canadian Airlines as of September 30th. About 2.3 million are Air Canada customers. Instead of protecting consumers, the Canadian Transportation Agency mounted a disinformation campaign on its Twitter and on its own website. On March 25th, the agency published its statement on vouchers that told the public, without any basis or authority, that airlines don't have to refund canceled flights, but may provide an IOU instead. The agency's position can be summarized as follows. First, it says that an airline can cancel a flight for reasons outside the carrier's control and keep passengers' money so long as the ticket was marked non-refundable. Second, the agency blames you, lawmakers, for ostensibly tying its hands and taking away its power to order airlines to refund passengers. These are pseudo-legal arguments that conflate a refund with compensation for inconvenience. Refund means the repayment of the price paid for services or goods. For example, if you order an item on the internet, but you don't get what you paid for, the seller must give you a refund. Airline tickets are no different. In 2004, when the agency was still independent and impartial, it made a binding legal decision recognizing passengers' right to a refund for flights canceled by an airline, even if the reason is outside the carrier's control. The agency reaffirmed this principle in 3 subsequent decisions in 2013 and 14 and coined it a fundamental right of passengers. These legally binding decisions are based on statutes and regulations that are still in force today. There is no gap in the law on refunds. The Transportation Modernization Act imposed additional obligations on airlines to pay compensation for inconvenience for flight cancellations that are within the carrier's control, but it did not alter passengers' fundamental right to a refund. It is not the law that had changed, but the agency's willingness to act independently and impartially and to enforce the law as written. The agency's misleading statement has caused significant harm to the public and to the entire travel industry. Not only the airlines, but also travel agents, credit card issuers, and even travel insurers use the agency's statement as an excuse to deprive passengers of refunds for flights that the airlines themselves canceled. The agency's conduct has undermined consumers' confidence in the Canadian travel industry and the government to respect private property and protect consumer rights. The loss of confidence will slow the entire sector's recovery. Our core values and respect for the rule of law cannot be swept aside just because a major Canadian industry may suffer financially.
1 minute,
The
Mr.
law
Lucas.
must always prevail. In the past months, we have seen lawlessness displace order and regulatory capture displace good government. It may fall upon the courts to restore order. However, it is your mandate as elected representatives to restore good government and to put an end to the agency running amok. Declaratory legislation, such as Bill C-249, is needed to restore public confidence in the rule of law. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lucas. That was actually bang on. Good for you. I'll now go to Ms. Di Bellafio. The floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Thank you for this opportunity to present our comments today. I have been a lawyer with Option Consummateurs for 10 years, founded in 1983. Option Consommateur is a nonprofit whose mission is to help consumers and defend their rights. As such, we receive thousands of requests for legal information every year from people experiencing difficulties with merchants, including in the travel industry. Since the beginning of the pandemic, we have received a record number of calls and emails from consumers, not only from Quebec, but elsewhere in Canada, asking us for information as to how to obtain a refund for their airline tickets. And this is what I'd like to speak to you about today, because the situation is unequivocal. Canadian consumers who have had their flights canceled because of the pandemic must be reimbursed. While it is true that the COVID-19 pandemic is difficult for everyone, consumers and merchants alike, it does not suspend existing law. The solution offered by most air carriers, travel credits, is an unacceptable and unfair solution. In our view, it is high time for the federal governments to assume their responsibilities and protect Canadian consumers. Under the pretext of force majeure, airlines have taken it upon themselves to keep their customers' money without delivering the service they paid for. To date, Both the Transportation Agency and the government have limited themselves to maintaining that the air passenger protection regulations do not require air carriers to reimburse their customers for canceled flights. However, it's important to note that these regulations do not exclusively and exhaustively set out all of the obligations for air carriers. Other laws and regulations impose binding obligations and give authorities the power to act. For example, the Transportation Act and its regulations give the CTA the power to intervene, particularly when a fare contains an unreasonable term or condition. It's difficult to see how, in a society where there is rule of law, that it could be considered reasonable for a company to impose an unreasonable term on clients, enabling it to keep the money without having to provide the service. But this is not all. Contracts with air carriers are also subject to provincial law. In Quebec, the province we know best, both the Civil Code of Quebec and the Consumer Protection Act contain provisions that make it clear that air carriers have an obligation to reimburse their customers for flights that had to be cancelled due to the pandemic. We don't understand the silence of the government and the CTA on this issue. They have to have responsibility to enforce the law and regulations. In fact, Bill C-249, a declaratory bill, was tabled recently in the House of Commons and reiterates the rights of passengers to obtain refunds for flights cancelled for reasons beyond the carrier's control. Travel credits offered by airlines are by no means a valid solution in the current context, where the financial health of households is being severely tested. Since the beginning of the crisis, our organization has received several hundred calls from consumers who are worried, disappointed, and frustrated that they will not be able to get their money back. And often this is several $1,000s, money that they could really use right now. Our petition asking airlines to reimburse consumers has now more than 32,000 signatures. We're told that airlines are facing significant revenue losses due to the pandemic. We have no doubt about that. However, this pandemic has also hit industries other than the airline industry and hard. It is not up to consumers to finance airlines. Many consumers are struggling to keep their heads above water. While the measures put in place to help Canadian families have been a great help, they do not ensure the financial health of households over the long term. People need their money, and they need it now. It's clear that consumers are being manipulated on this issue. On the one hand, carriers say they can't pay them back without government assistance. On the other hand, the government says that it's ready to negotiate with the carriers for assistance that would be conditional on reimbursing consumers. In the meantime, nothing's moving, and consumers are the big losers. It is high time that this change. Thank you.
Good job. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, we don't receive any translation, unfortunately.
Mr. Clerk, did you want to check on that translation?
Yeah, we have IT reaching out to him right now.
Okay,
Thank
great.
you.
Thank you, Mr. Lucas. We're now going to go on to Mr. Lawford. Mr. Lawford, 5 minutes. The floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Honorable members, my name is John Lawford. I'm the Executive Director and General Counsel at the Public Interest Advocacy Center, which is a nonprofit and registered charity. We provide legal and research services on behalf of consumers, and in particular, vulnerable consumers, concerning important public services such as airlines, and a field we've been working in for over 20 years. PIAC has heard many complaints from consumers about the lack of cash refunds for flight cancellations due to COVID-19. Our message: COVID-19 is an exceptional situation and passengers deserve cash refunds. Consumers and citizens feel, given the circumstances of an unprecedented global panic disrupting all domestic and international travel, and the economic precariousness caused by the pandemic, and larger personal monetary losses suffered by many travelers, that receiving vouchers or any other option besides refunds is inadequate and unacceptable. They are correct. Consumers know the general rules for normal times. They know that when they purchase a non-refundable ticket, that they will not be refunded if they cancel, not the airline. They know most airlines' policies are to provide only a voucher good for 1 year if the airline cancels a flight. This buyer beware situation is not loved, but it is understood. federal government has brought airline cancellation and refund practice more into line with consumer desires in normal times with the Air Passenger Protection Regulations. The APPRs are a very good thing, but they're too complex to describe here. But which, as you've heard from Mr. Striner, had not anticipated a global travel crisis on such a scale as now. Whether there should be a cash refund for all types of tickets and whether airlines or customers cancel the flight for such large scale and system-wide shutdowns as COVID, and who bears the risk of paying for such a refund protection scheme is a legitimate matter for debate. We think there should be some provision made, and return to that now. One contingency plan that could be is a compensation fund similar to the Ontario Travel Industry Compensation Fund. This fund is financed by registered travel agents and travel wholesalers in Ontario, administered by the Travel Industry Council of Ontario. It provides reimbursement for bankruptcy and insolvency of an Ontario registrant or end supplier airline or cruise line. A similar compensation fund could be paid out of a small levy on all airline tickets, whether purchased directly from the airline on a website or through an online or in-person travel agent. It would require an administration and would likely result in a pass-through charge to consumers. But then there would be a fund for a situation just like COVID. Another method could be to introduce a formal legal mechanism, which mandates that airlines must segregate funds which they receive from passengers for future flights and keep them separate until the passenger actually departs. This is simply keeping the consumer monies in trust until they travel, and it would equitably belong to the customer if travel were canceled. Terms of this legal trust mechanism could limit it to payouts only in situations like the present or be more generous. Our understanding is that both solutions would be opposed by the industry. However, even if we cannot protect consumers on this scale in the future, PIAC insists that for this crisis, it is only just and reasonable that all Canadians be fully refunded for having had travel canceled or disrupted by COVID-19, and ignoring niceties of refundable versus non-refundable or customer-initiated versus airline-initiated cancellation. We note that the Transport Minister appears to agree with us. Why? Because airlines are going to be bailed out with taxpayer money. The federal government must ensure that passengers get their refunds for flight cancellations, because otherwise, those taxpayers who did not get a refund will bail out airlines and be penalized twice.
1 minute, Mr. Lawford.
A huge advantage to such a refund jubilee is that cash refunds will simply and significantly reduce the huge backlog of complaints at the Canadian Transportation Agency. Unsurprisingly, the majority of complaints since March concern refunds. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I look forward to any questions from the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Lawford. Well done. We'll now go on to Mr. Jack for 5 minutes. Mr. Jack, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I doubt I'll get a gold star, but I'll try my best. Thank you very much to the committee for this invitation this afternoon. CIA was founded in 1913 to represent the interests of motorists originally, but the world has evolved since then, and so have we. We have 6.5 million members today from coast to coast, and the services we offer them extend well beyond emergency roadside assistance. We're very proud to be named one of Canada's top 2 most trusted brands 3 years in a row by the Gustafson School of Business at the University of Victoria. Today, we are also one of Canada's largest leisure travel agencies through our store network and online. Cela dit, nous sommes toujours un OSBL.
That being said, we always are client-oriented, and our first priority is to defend consumers.
So, prior to the pandemic, our travel specialists worked with average Canadian air passengers every day. And when the pandemic hit, they worked tirelessly to bring home our members who were stranded overseas. Notre maîtrise de marché nous
We are now able to take a position with respect to the Air Passenger Regulations Act.
hit soon afterwards, and we saw that the regime, the APPR, was inadequate to protect consumers. That's because the regime carves out events beyond a carrier's control from any requirement to provide a refund. In retrospect, this was a huge mistake. Since March, CIA has been pushing for access to refunds for Canadians left holding the bag when their flights got canceled due to COVID-19. Thousands of Canadians were left with multi-$1,000 holes in their finances through no fault of their own. En quelque sorte, ils ont dû
Essentially, they were forced to provide interest-free loans to the carriers at a time when they could least afford it.
Commitment to getting passengers their money back. We will be watching closely to make sure this commitment is honored and that passengers can get cash refunds quickly. Keep in mind that thousands of people have been out of pocket already for 6 months or longer. For those who've been hard hit economically by the pandemic, this is especially unfair. At the same time, we recognize the carriers are struggling and Canadians need them to survive. In many other jurisdictions, governments have already stepped in to make sure their carriers remain viable, but also that passengers are not left to finance them.
We are pleased the Government of Canada has finally agreed to do the same thing.
Carriers have refunded some fares. The vast majority of travelers affected by COVID cancellations have not received a penny. This patchwork, in which the wealthy and business travelers who can afford refundable tickets get better treatment than average citizens, is exactly what the APPR was supposed to end. CAA urges the federal government to ensure that refunds are made available in a timely fashion. COVID-19 has brought significant financial hardship on average Canadian families, and it is only fair that they can get cash refunds if they want them.
We must remember that these flights were cancelled through no fault of the passenger.
Focus on rectifying this past injustice, however, but also on making sure it never happens again. This is to the benefit not only of passengers, but of the economy as well. Getting Canadians back on planes in large numbers depends on health measures, absolutely, but also on consumer confidence about their purchase. What average Canadian would voluntarily spend thousands of dollars on tickets for their family today, knowing they might forfeit all their money if there is another unpredictable lockdown at home or at their destination? The government should ensure that in the future, flights canceled due to government health warnings or shutdowns are automatically refundable. As mentioned, we're also a travel agency, and we note travel agents should not lose out on commissions owed to them. Agents did their work, and in many cases, the carriers have been holding their money since the spring. Consumers should be made whole, but we feel the government has a responsibility to agents as well. Finally, let me briefly outline CAA's other priorities for air passenger rights, which we urge you to consider. While the pandemic revealed a major shortcoming that should be fixed, it remains a fact that the APPR brought Canada its first industry-wide code of conduct for airlines. Soulignons que les États-Unis et
We should point out that the US and the EU already had similar regimes for a decade or more.
regulations only came into full force in mid-December of last year, and in their first 3 months prior to the pandemic, 11,000 complaints were filed. While the lack of air travel performance data leaves us flying blind, we believe it's still too early to fully grade the regime. Most of the complaints filed haven't even been addressed. We need to let the APPR run for a further period and then grade it. We do not believe it needs to be reopened at this time, other than to address the COVID-19 refund situation. Our other issues include the real cost of air travel to middle-class Canadians, for example, airport fees and a la carte pricing, making sure the government lives up to its commitment to provide public air travel performance data in a useful and timely fashion, making sure the CTA has adequate resources to enforce the APPR, and CATSA reform so passengers can move more efficiently through security.
1 minute, Mr. Jack.
Honorable member de committee, je vous remercie.
Honorable members, I'd like to thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Jack. And I'm happy to inform you that you received your gold star.
Yay!
Well done.
My work here is done.
Mr. Kerr, did you have any comments? I know, Mr. Kerr, you're here with.
Thank you, Mr.
Jack.
Chair. Nothing to add at this point in time.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Kerr. We're now going to go on to Mr. Sparling. Mr. Sparling, you have 5 minutes. Welcome.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak with you today. Air North Yukon's airline's been in business for 43 years. We're based in Whitehorse, and we currently provide gateway jet service from our Whitehorse hub to Vancouver, Kelowna, and Victoria, and regional turboprop service to Dawson City, Old Crow, and Inuvik. We are 100% Yukon owned, and our shareholders include more than 1,500 local Yukoners, including the Vuntut Gwitchin First Nation, who hold a 49% interest. With more than 200 Yukon or Northern employees, we are one of the largest private sector employers in the Yukon. My purpose in today's discussion is to provide the committee with a Northern airline perspective on how the government might best help Canadian airlines return to financial stability while minimizing the burden on taxpayers. In the longer term, airlines will return to sustainability when people start to travel again. In the short term, governments have stepped up with financial assistance, for which this airline is most thankful. In the medium term, which is likely to be years rather than months, if governments choose to continue to provide assistance, then we believe that the burden on taxpayers could be minimized by attaching strategic conditions to financial aid. The logic behind this is simply that much of the $8 to date have effectively funded excess capacity or empty seats, with the result being that the aid has been somewhat ineffective in stemming record industry losses. Taxpayers shouldn't be paying airlines to burn jet fuel and wear out airplanes flying empty seats around. We believe that it would be far more productive to use subsidy efforts to help all airlines undergo a very necessary temporary contraction so as to ensure that they can operate sustainably with reduced traffic and flying volumes while maintaining essential services and affordable pricing. The government's commitment to support air service to regional communities underscores the need to support regional airlines. There are currently 23 air carriers in Canada providing service to 189 communities. Only 57 of these are served by Air Canada or WestJet. 131 have a population of less than 10,000, and only 49 are served by more than one airline. In the Yukon market, we compete with both mainline carriers, one of them seasonally, on our gateway routes. During the course of the pandemic, the resultant excess capacity has doubled the subsidy required to support our essential services. Mainline carriers only do part of the job in the north because they don't fly to any regional communities. This is akin to skimming the cream off the top and leaving the milk to go sour. To protect essential services to, from, and within the north, we've asked the government to temporarily limit mainline carrier capacity in northern gateway markets. We've also asked the government to make interline agreements mandatory for all Canadian air carriers. Mandatory interline agreements would help to level the playing field between large mainline air carriers and small regional carriers, and would protect consumers and increase competition by making mainline route networks and wholesale pricing available to consumers in regional communities. Cooperation among suppliers is a feature of national policy in both the rail and the telecommunications sectors, and in this environment, it makes sense for airlines as well. Now, you might raise your eyebrows at a proposal to temporarily limit competition, but remember, it was not that long ago that limiting competition was the norm. The Canadian airline industry was not deregulated until 1987, and the North was not deregulated until 1996. In 1977, when we started our business, if we wanted to fly between Whitehorse and Vancouver, we would have been required to demonstrate public convenience and necessity to the Canadian Transport Committee, and our application would likely have been denied because at that time the market was only producing about 300 passengers per day, which was enough to support Canadian Pacific's 2 daily milk run flights to Whitehorse. With our recent border lockdown, the Yukon market is currently producing only 104 daily passengers, yet there are 3 daily nonstop flights to Vancouver in the market. The U.S. provides subsidy for thin airline routes through its Essential Air Services program, but only one carrier is subsidized on any route. In Canada, we're currently subsidizing competing carriers on several routes, and in the Yukon, taxpayers are effectively subsidizing 3 air carriers to fly the same route.
1 minute, Mr. Sperling.
Competition is important, but it's only one factor in keeping airfares low. Airline costs are a much larger influencer of price, and in that respect, the numbers don't lie. The cost of flying a passenger on a 50% full flight is exactly 50% more than on a 75% full flight, so it's much more important to get capacity right. In closing, there's been much discussion about financial aid for airlines and about competition and service to regional communities, but the numbers really tell the story. The industry is in trouble and in need of more help. Data shows that the impact of industry aid may be optimized with a minimum impact on taxpayers while protecting regional communities and consumers if appropriate policies and associated conditions are used to leverage aid dollars. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sperling. Well done. I'm now going to go on to Mr. Charbonneau. Mr. Charbonneau, welcome, and you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, I'd like to thank you for the invitation to appear before this committee. Volretard is a company that helps passengers obtain monetary compensation or reimbursement following a flight cancellation or delay, simply, quickly, and without risk. The last time that I had the opportunity to appear here was in connection with Bill C-49, which was introduced as a protection regime for air passengers. At that time, we took a critical look at the shortcomings of this bill. We pointed out that several provisions were of greater benefit and protection to carriers than to consumers. The complexity of the Act, its regulations, opens the door to many interpretations and makes it easier for carriers to shirk their obligation to provide compensation or a refund. We had been promised a simple regime that would be at the forefront of the various international programs. The current crisis is unprecedented and greatly affects the airline and tourism industry. It's highlighted the shortcomings of the protection regime in place, the processes, controls, and agencies responsible for its proper functioning. The government and the CTA have been slow to take action to protect consumers. Very early in the crisis, the European Commission and the U.S. Department of Transportation ruled that carriers must reimburse consumers for unused portions of flights. Not only was this not the case in Canada, but the CTA even encouraged consumers to settle for credits for future travel, stating that they had to abide by existing fare rules. While other countries were issuing clear guidelines compelling carriers to refund unused portions of their tickets, the CTA, and I quote, quickly took temporary measures to mitigate the significant impact on airlines by applying temporary exemptions, including the obligation to pay compensation or to reprotect passengers through other carriers. The CTA has granted airlines an extension of the regulatory deadline for responding to passenger claims for compensations. Airlines had until October 28th to respond to all claims pending since March 25th or filed between March 25th and September 29th, representing a 700% increase in the time allowed. The agency ordered that all dispute resolution proceedings before the agency involving Air Canada be suspended until June 30th, including any application received for formal dispute resolution during the period of suspension. As a result, the agency moved quickly to put in place measures to protect carriers at the expense of consumers. This raises the question of what the CTA's role is and who benefits from it. Mr. McNanny of the National Airlines Council of Canada said in his statement that the foreign companies that received support were beginning to gain market share. Yet, Air Canada, which was in a good liquidity position at the beginning of the crisis and has obtained billions in cash plus billions of dollars in non-refunded tickets, is probably better positioned on a pro-rata basis than others to deal with this crisis. Moreover, I am stunned when I see a company asking for public assistance to survive on the one hand and offering a golden retirement, several $1 million annually, to its outgoing president on the other. I listened to the various stakeholders. Passengers expect a certain level of service, and we're not talking about fancy cutlery here. Simply being able to speak to someone when they have a problem or getting reimbursed is important. Unfortunately, the airlines have failed in their obligations, and consumers have not been protected. And this was well before the crisis. The longer we wait, the more consumers lose out. This situation has been ongoing now for insurers, travel agencies, and travel agents. And they shouldn't be the ones responsible for paying the cost of all of these problems. To conclude, I'd like to make the committee aware of the fact that there were problems before this crisis. Several situations have shown that the services provided to consumers are often neglected, and often consumers are held hostage to these rules. Now we're talking about merging two carriers, which will reduce healthy competition here in Canada. I listened to the various stakeholders during the various transfers of this committee mention how much the airline industry is an economic lung in Canada. Do we have to realize the consequence of our decisions by this and put an entire industry at risk? Thank you.
Mr. Charbonneau, well done. Great job. We now have a speakers list. We're going to start off with the Conservatives, with Ms. Cusi, followed by Mr. Alcuri from the Liberals, Mr. Barcelona-Duval from the Bloc, and followed by Mr. Bacharach from the NDP, all for 6 minutes each. Ms. Kusi, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'll start with Dr. Lucas. Dr. Lucas, why do you think the Canadian Transportation Agency allowed vouchers in place of refunds to Canadians?
That is a question that one should be looking into further. Certainly, passengers did not ask for it. That measure benefits airlines and stonewalls passengers. That is one more reason that it's so important. It would be so important for this committee to review in details all the correspondence that happened between the Canadian Transportation Agency, the government, and the airlines.
Okay, I'll state very clearly that the position of the Conservative Party has been that passenger refund should be tied to some type of air plan for the airline sector. Why do you think the government has been so very slow to address this entire comprehensive issue of a plan for the airline sector, which in our opinion would allow passengers to be refunded in total? And I recognize you want to see the law enforced, but why do you think the government has been so slow to respond to this global issue, sort of to allow the food chain of payments, if you will, down the line? Why have they been so slow to respond, Dr.
Mr. Lucas?
Mr. Chair, I don't want to speculate about those reasons. Our position is that the airlines have to issue those refunds. And when you look at the actual fact that the balance sheets, for example, for Air Canada, which does have public financial data, they would have had the money to refund passengers. Those airlines may need some support down the line, but there's no sign the airlines are on brink of bankruptcy. If the airlines are in a position of being unable to issue refunds as opposed to unwilling, there are proper procedures in this country for dealing with that. There is the BIA, the Bankruptcy and Insolvency Act. There is the CCAA, the Companies Creditors Arrangements Act, often called as bankruptcy protection. Neither of the airlines in question, none of the airlines in question have applied for any of those instruments, which indicates that they are solvent, they do have the money, they just don't want to pay.
Ms. Kusi?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Dr. Lucas. Mr. Lawford, you mentioned something I think that is of great significance going forward through the pandemic and beyond as we look to the vaccine, and that's the loss of confidence in the traveling Canadian public. Now, usually we attribute this loss, I would say, to the health and safety risks the public currently associates with flying, but you related it to the lack of refunds, and you made a very good point that tens of thousands of Canadians have invested um, lots of money into purchasing tickets, and this has created a loss of confidence within them for future travel. Can you expand upon that, please? If the government doesn't act to provide a global plan allowing for passengers to be reimbursed, can you expand upon that loss of confidence we'll see in the traveling public as a result of their uncertainty in receiving a refund should they book a flight?
Dr. Lucas?
Excuse me, that was for Mr. Lawford, Chair.
I'm sorry, Mr. Lawford?
Thank you for the question. The return to normality once the pandemic is controlled will be slower if consumers believe that in similar situations which are totally outside their control, they will lose money. The thing about a service such as airlines is that the value of it often fades or is actually impossible to capitalize on. I'm thinking of older travelers, people who have a once in a lifetime opportunity to see family members in other countries who are nearing the end of their lives, this sort of thing. Those are not replaceable. And if you have people hesitating to take those flights, they just won't do it anymore, and the recovery will be slower. So that's our main concern around that. Also, the legal regime is very uncertain, as Dr. Lukash pointed out. That should be tightened up because at the moment, honestly, we cannot advise Canadians that the rules are clear and that in this case this will happen and in that case that'll happen, and that's a difficult position for us to be in because we can't tell the folks what to expect right from the start.
Ms. Kusi, 30 seconds.
Thank you, Chair.
I'm sorry,
I'm
sorry, Stephanie, 30 minute and 30 seconds.
No problem at all, Chair. Thank you. Mr. Sparling, Of course, in the speech from the throne, we saw the announcement for airlines specifically relative to the North, and this was re-announced again in last week's fall economic statement. Is the funding provided by the government enough? And my second question to you, Mr. Sparling, is has the government been receptive at all to your idea of interline agreements?
Mr. Sparling?
Well, to answer your first question, is the funding enough? We don't know where the bottom's going to be in this, but I think as I've observed with associated conditions associated with tied to the funding, it would certainly be enough. We're comfortable we could operate with less financial relief if we could get more people on our airplanes, and we could get more people on our airplanes if there weren't if there was some steps taken to rationalize capacity in our market. Your second question was, refresh my memory, sorry.
Interline agreement, the reception by the government to this?
Not a lot of traction so far, but we're working on it. I think it's one of those things that I think, as I expressed in my remarks, the notion of market intervention is not one that first comes to mind for the government. So, and it's probably not one that they're hearing from everybody, but to me, it just makes sense. So we're just going to keep on with the same message.
Thank you, Ms. Cusi, and thank you.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci aux témoins.
We're now going to move on to the Liberal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses.
Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to our witnesses. It's a delicate situation. On the one side, you have people who purchased tickets and have the right to be reimbursed, and to me, and to most people, it's the absolute priority. If we can support the air sector so that they can protect their employee, that would be also something important. So in such a situation, and we don't know how long this pandemic will last, and how much urgency there will be. If air companies were to be bankrupt, all their product would be sold, and it would go to the debitors, to the banks, etc. So what would the passenger get? And would there be enough money after having reimbursed the banks to pay their tickets? I would like to know what you think about it. Thank you for your question. I don't know the financial state of all airline companies, but I'm sure the consumer would be the last to be paid. So in the case a carrier would be bankrupt, unfortunately, the traveler would be the last to be paid. So if we give a chance for the air carrier to protect their rights, there is a possibility that the travelers would be reimbursed at the very end. I'm not sure I understood your question. Well, let me repeat it. So if we give some support to the air carrier so that they can keep employers at the there will be eventually a possibility for these air carriers to reimburse the passengers. I have nothing against the idea of for the government to support air carrier. The only idea is not to give money just any which way. But why? Sure, the government could assess the situation and give them support if necessary. We are in an unprecedented situation, and we understand that it's very hard for everyone. But we also have a lot of consumers who have a very difficult time and they need their own money. And we're not talking about $20 here. We're talking about several $1,000, and those people need their money. Well, if the air carrier, despite this critical situation, decided to reimburse travelers with no, well, would that accelerate the situation? That is to say, where in the situation where they ask the taxpayer to give or lend money, and would we not be in that situation then? So why, on top of it, have create an anger in your client in this way? Well, as I said, the fact to support air companies or airline companies is not an issue if the government wishes to do that. The important thing, as Mr. Lawford said, it's that travelers need to be trusting the companies, and it would jeopardize this trust. And it's not always the voucher may not be used. These credits are not really valid if those people do not have the opportunity to travel again. And to the very least, people should have the choice. If they don't want a voucher or a travel credit, they should be reimbursed. In another, well, is it an abusive use to say that air carrier could not have known how long this pandemic would last? And they could not also know with certainty whether the government federal would support them and how much. Well, if we talk about abuse, well, nobody knows how long the pandemic is going to last, and we don't have a crystal ball, so it's your guess is as good as mine. So it's not obvious for air companies, but and also there's no guarantee for the government to support them. But so far, they got help for the salary, for the wages, but other companies had financial difficulties and they had the obligation to reimburse the products. So I don't see why air carriers should have a different system.
Great questions. We're now going to move on to the Bloc Québécois. Mr. Bracelet-Duval for 6 minutes. The floor is yours.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My first question is for Ms. Bellefeuille. In what you said earlier, you said that according to the Civil Code of Quebec, the service that haven't been delivered should be reimbursed. So theoretically, the companies should have reimbursed their clients. However, the Minister of Transportation and the CAT or CAT preferred, or at least helped accepted the vouchers, and in a way that's a breach of the civil code. Do you think it's a responsible thing to do from that the minister should do such a thing? Well, the civil code is not a penal code or a criminal code, so I have a difficulty with the term of breach. But in the civil code, there are provisions saying that in cases of acts of God, and it says that even if there's an act of God, if the company received money, well, the company should reimburse the money that hasn't been used for the services that were paid for. Well, the idea is that an act of God should not be used to enrich yourselves. I mean, it's a provision of the civil code that has to do with the membership contract. Well, it means that contracts that you can't negotiate. So if you have a signed contract, even if in your tariff it says that you don't have to reimburse, well, I have difficulties to understand that it would not be an abuse if the company takes the money and just go with it without giving a service. Well, and the position of the Minister of Transportation and the office, the CAT, do you think it's normal? Well, it's a very disappointing. The CAT and the federal government will say that it's not their responsibility to invoke the provincial law, and they're right. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that the provincial right should be put aside. I think it would have been more appropriate to say that, yes, there are federal rules, but there are other obligations, and the federal enterprises should abide by those as well, especially to protect consumer. Thank you. I think it's an interesting way to shed light, saying that the provincial laws should be respected as much as the federal laws. You talked about the vouchers because people are offered vouchers instead of reimbursement in cash. Could you mention the difference between the two, and why is the voucher needs or a credit for travel is not acceptable? Well, in order to use this voucher, you have to actually buy a new trip. And there are some trips that you don't foresee. Sometimes it's a special event or it's a special occasion, and they are no longer relevant after the end of the pandemics. And we don't know how long it will take before we can travel in full security. We will have vaccines in Canada, but we don't know exactly how they will be distributed, and also distributed in the countries where you would like to go to. So this voucher doesn't guarantee any prices. Perhaps it won't be enough to be able to do the same trip, and they will have to spend more money to do the exact same trip. And as I mentioned, in the case of the pandemic, many people had financial losses, important ones, and some are having a lot of difficulties. Not everybody did get this special government help, and a lot of travelers may not be able to travel right away after the pandemic. I have another question for you. Several weeks ago, I tabled C-48, a bill that says that companies should reimburse travelers. Do you think that it would be a good thing if the House of Commons were to adopt this law? I think so. I mean, the bill is simply reiterating a right that already exists. According to us, there is already those tools are already there in the rules and regulations to make sure that consumers can be reimbursed, but perhaps there is a different interpretation that's more restrictive. But I think to reiterate the same thing would be a good idea. My last question, and you might not be able to answer fully. We made reference to tickets, reimbursable ticket and non-reimbursable tickets, as if some tickets could not be reimbursed. What could you say about this? Well, you have to make the distinction between the consumer that didn't choose to travel. For instance, if he changed his mind or her mind, and the case where the air carrier did not provide the service, which is a different situation altogether. Mr. Speaker, you are on mute.
The first time I did it today, so I'm not doing too bad. Thank you, Mr. Barcelona, and thank you, Miss Belfield. We're now going to move on to the NDP. Mr. Bacharach, floor is yours for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for appearing today. My first questions are for Mr. Lucas. Mr. Lucas, why should airline passengers be concerned about the March 25th statement on vouchers? And is it a typical practice for the CTA to issue such statements?
Mr. Lucas.
Mr. Chair, thank you for the honorable member for the question. The March 25th statement issued by the agency misleads the public about their rights. A quasi-judicial body does not speak through public statements. It speaks through its decisions. Issuing some general, broad policy guides, interpretation guides about new regulations may happen, but about a matter which is contested, about matter which is already before the body or very likely to come before that body in a very, very short time is entirely unacceptable. I'm sure you realize that no court in Canada would speak through such public statements. Judges, decision makers, people who act in a quasi-judicial capacity speak through their decisions.
Mr. Lucas, why do you think the CTA issued the statement on vouchers?
That's a question we would very much like to know the answer to. Certainly, passengers did not ask for it. The statement on vouchers beneficial to airlines and harms passengers. We would very much like to see the documents, the correspondence, the internal memos that led to that statement, including emails within the agency, emails between the agency and the airlines, and between the agency and other branches of the government.
Now, Mr. Strainer, the chair of the CTA, appeared at our committee, and I know that you watched his testimony. I asked him a question around the air transportation regulations and his interpretation and their implications for refunds in situations outside the airline's control, particularly Section 122 of the regulations, which state that every tariff shall contain the terms and conditions of carriage, clearly stating the air carrier's policy in respect of at least the following matters, and then it lists refunds for services purchased but not used. I know you know that this passage, but it clearly indicates either within the air carrier's control or otherwise. And his response was essentially that these regulations state that the tariff shall address those issues, but that refunds are not necessarily required. I assume you have a different interpretation. Could you share why you disagree with him?
Mr. Lucas?
Mr. Chair, the regulations have to be read as a whole. Section 122 of the Air Transportation Regulation is not a standalone provision. It has to read in conjunction with Section 111, which also requires terms and conditions to be just and reasonable. In the past 16 years, the Canadian Transportation Agency confirmed correctly that those provisions that require to have provisions about refunds in the tariff have to be read in conjunction with the requirements that those provisions be reasonable, and reasonable here means requiring airlines at the very least to refund passengers for flights that were canceled regardless of the reason for the cancellation. To have a provision about refunds for any reason, but then those provisions saying no refunds would defeat the purpose of the law, and it would not make any sense.
Mr. Bachrach?
Thank you, Mr. Lucas, and thank you, Mr. Chair. We also heard from Mr. Strainer about the fact that, in his opinion, the gaps in the air passenger protection regulations that the pandemic have exposed were not anticipated in advance and could not have been foreseen. And we've heard similar testimony from other witnesses. Do you think this is a fair assessment?
It is not a fair assessment at all. First of all, when it comes to the issue of refunds, there are no gaps. The APPR is indeed poorly drafted, but it is not a complete code. For example, the APPR does not say that passengers are entitled to a seat in the cabin, but the APPR's silence does not mean the airline can transport passengers in a cargo bay. The situation is similar with respect to refunds. With respect to this specific issue, it is simply not well drafted. The fundamental right of passengers to a refund should have been incorporated in the APPR for simple clarity purposes, which would have spared the public of this issue. We cautioned the agency about it in our 52-page report. We cautioned the agency about it during our consultation. Unfortunately, the agency did not listen. The government did not listen.
Mr. Bachrach?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Lucas, Minister Garneau, when he appeared before the committee, he expressed concerns about the financial difficulties faced by the major airlines. His concern specifically, and we've heard similar concerns from Mr. El-Khoury, was that if the government were to force the airlines to provide the refunds, certain airlines that are facing financial difficulties might go bankrupt. I guess the question is this really a fair assessment of the airline's ability to pay these refunds? What have you learned in your research?
Mr. Lucas?
Mr. Chair, Based on the publicly available information, that is not a fair assessment. With respect to Air Canada, which has financial data publicly, that would not be true. The best evidence of the serious doubts about the veracity of those statements is that none of the airlines have filed any kind of bankruptcy protection or insolvency or any kind of proceeding that would signal that they are in financial distress. Even if they were in financial distress, it does not mean that they can pick and choose which creditors they are paying first. Passengers' money and airfares paid in advance is often money held in trust. So quite possibly those would be secured creditors, or other rules would apply to their rights that may precede other creditors. That is what bankruptcy courts are for, to make sure that those decisions are made fairly. If there is a risk of bankruptcy, it is not for the government to decide which creditors, whether passengers or banks, will be first in the line.
Thank you, Mr. Lucas. Thank you, Mr. Backrack.
Thank you,
We're now,
Mr. Chair.
You're welcome. Now we're going to go to the second round. Second round's 5 minutes each for Mr. Cram of the Conservatives, Mr. Rogers from the Liberals, and 2.5 minutes each for Mr. Barstow Duval of the Bloc, and Mr. Backrack of the NDP. Mr. Cram, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. My questions are for Mr. Sparling of Air North. I will confess that I've never been to the Yukon Territory, but I hear it's beautiful, and it's definitely on my bucket list of places to visit someday. I suspect there may be other members of the committee who have never been to that region of the country either. So, first of all, I was wondering if you could just give the committee a better idea of what it means to the people of the Yukon Territory to have their own regional airline to service their communities and to meet their needs.
Mr. Sparling.
Well, in terms of airline economics, you've likely all heard of people describe airlines as often run in a hub and spoke system. In a typical hub and spoke system, the cash tends to flow from the spoke to the hub. So in the case of the Yukon, by making the Yukon our hub, when Yukoners buy their travel locally, their travel dollars stay in the Yukon to support the local economy. And when visitors come to the Yukon, their travel dollars flow into the Yukon to support the local economy. And I don't know how familiar you are with territorial economics, but it costs about $1.5 billion a year to run the territory. We only generate 200 to 300 million ourselves. The rest comes courtesy of Southern taxpayers. So there's a lot of interest in making territories, our territory in particular, more self-sufficient. And I think that by creating our own airline in the Yukon, I think that we've taken a big step in that direction. Indigenous ownership, 49% stake by the Vuntut-Gwitchin First Nation. One of the clauses in all of the Yukon First Nation land claim settlements is a commitment by both the federal and the territorial governments to take steps to help First Nations participate in the territorial economy. And I think that the investment in Air North by the Vuntut-Gwitchin was one of the first such investments made by a Yukon First Nation. And I think it's generally regarded as perhaps a great template of just how First Nations can participate in a territorial economy.
Mr. Cram.
Okay, very good. Last month, various news outlets reported that NAV Canada was planning to shut down air traffic control towers at several airports across the country, including at Eric Nielsen Whitehorse International Airport. As a major tenant of that airport, can you explain to the committee how the loss of the air traffic control tower at the airport in Whitehorse would affect your operations, both at present and as air traffic increases as we come out of the pandemic?
Well, firstly, as an industry, we sympathize with NAV Canada's problems, just like the rest of us, trying to keep their expenses from getting too far ahead of their revenues. And NAV Canada has proposed a 30% rate increase to airlines. And as an industry, we've come back to them and said, look at cutting costs before you look at increasing rates. So as a Whitehorse-based operator, we have to be a little bit careful about criticizing every area in which they choose to cut costs. Having said that, there are some peculiarities with Whitehorse. We are a non-radar environment. That's probably the most significant differentiator between our control tower and other control towers. And I think that if we were in a radar environment, if we had low-level radar, the safety considerations would be far less. So, we've reached out. Nav Canada hasn't made plans to formally close the tower. It's something they're considering, and we've come back to them saying, well, look, without radar, there are some safety considerations. Could you not look at perhaps reducing hours, reducing staffing, or do something else to save money instead?
Mr. Graham.
And Mr. Sparling, you were actually quoted in a news article about the closure of the air traffic control tower in Whitehorse. The November 26th edition of the Whitehorse Star reported that you had participated in some of the discussions with NAV Canada. Can you tell us if you have had any further discussions with NAV Canada on this topic since November 26th?
Mr. Sparling.
They reached out to us for feedback. We provided them feedback. Whether it was before or after November 26th, I can't remember.
Question, Mr. Graham?
Yes, and I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit more about the ownership structure of your airport and how it's particularly beneficial to making the North and the Yukon Territory self-sufficient.
Sorry, you're talking about the airport or the airline?
The airline.
Employment, with 1,500 local Yukon shareholders, that's between 1 in 15 and 1 in 20 Yukoners that has an equity stake in the airline. So our shareholders are our customers. When we hold our annual general meeting in our hangar, we get better than 10% of our shareholders show up. I don't think General Motors does that good. And our shareholders are a very engaged and interested group of people. The question of refunds came up. I'm surprised nobody's asked me, but we live in a small community. We don't sell the middle seat on our flights, and we do give refunds to passengers that need them. But in our market, people are going to travel, and only about 15% of our cancellations have resulted in refund requests. So we're very lucky in that most people are happy to accept vouchers, or credit for future travel. But the big guys, the international carriers, have been hammered by a drop in demand, and I sympathize with them. I mean, they're trying to stay afloat, and we've got it relatively easier here in that Northerners have to travel. People travel back and forth for medical. There's good cargo flow, and our regional routes. Old Crow doesn't have a road, so all of the groceries, building materials, consumer goods, absolutely everything that goes into that community has to be flown in. So there is with or without a pandemic, there's a somewhat stable level of demand for air service. It's just not what it was this time last year.
Thank you, Mr. Sparling. Thank you, Mr. Cram. Next is for the Liberals, we have Mr. Rogers. Insurance, floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. And first of all, let me welcome all of the different groups today, and the witnesses and their presentations are very interesting. And I'm sure we've heard from many groups now, individuals especially, and groups that are lobbying for cash refunds, of course. And rightly or wrongly, the airlines argue that such activities, as was referenced earlier, could cause them to fail. And that would be something we certainly wouldn't want. And that they're not legally obligated to offer refunds for some of the tickets they've sold without insurances and that kind of thing. So I want to ask Mr. Jack and Mr. Lawford to comment maybe in a situation or a scenario where the courts confirm, given the circumstances, that the airlines did in fact have the right to offer vouchers in lieu of cash reimbursements. What would you advocate for at that point? For instance, should vouchers be valid for longer than 2 years? So I'd like for Mr. Jack or Mr. Lawford or both to comment on that, please.
Sure. Were I a politician, I might say I don't like to comment on hypotheticals, but I will, Mr. Chair, go ahead and answer the question. I think that under the circumstances, we have a government that has publicly stated that it will get refunds for people, and also that there is financial assistance on the table to the industry. So I don't know, in our case at least, that our first thought is not about the outcome of a court case. It's about the outcome of a negotiation that is said to be underway and that we hope will finish as soon as possible. As we noted in our remarks, some people have been out of pocket now for 6, 7, 8 months already, multiple thousands of dollars. I would say that other jurisdictions have gotten on with this and gotten it done. And that would be the EU, the US, several European jurisdictions. Their governments have gotten together with their carriers and have ensured that passengers have, at least in some circumstances, far more broadly than in Canada, gotten their money back. So it is more than possible to do this. And we just think both the government and the carriers need to get on with it. Thank you.
Mr. Rogers?
If I may.
Yes,
Mr.
Mr. Lawford, go
Lawford,
ahead.
if you could. Yeah.
Thank you. I would just add that were a court decision or a CTA decision that was sweeping to come to that conclusion, our constituents would not be happy, and we would be supporting a bill like C-249 to change the law. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Rogers?
Okay. Yeah. I want to go to another question here for probably Mr. Sparling. I think I understand that when Transport Canada approved the merger of Canadian North and First Air, they impose a lot of very strict conditions to protect against potentially predatory effects of a monopoly, I guess. Would you agree to those same conditions today?
Well, I think things have changed pretty significantly since the time of the merger. And, it's not really for me to comment on the Canadian North First Air, how they feel about it. But in my mind, I would expect that, and I don't know what the conditions were really, but I would expect that a lot of them would not be very appropriate in today's environment. If there were conditions relating to reduction in service, for example, when demand dries up, if you don't reduce service in some way, in some manner, you're just flying a lot of empty seats around. It makes no sense. The communities themselves, of course, have to have some minimum level of service. Many of their communities don't have road access, so there is a minimum level of service that needs to be maintained. But I expect that they'll figure out what that is based upon consultations with the community. We certainly did that in our market. The first thing we did when the pandemic hit is we reduced from 30 flights a week to 5 flights a week. And the first people we heard from was the hospital and the Yukon Government Emergency Measures Organization. They said, look, to keep the emergency supplies flowing, we need to have more flights. So we worked out a schedule with them and added back some flights right away to make sure that there was enough service to look after the essential supplies and transportation, even if it was less than the actual level of demand. So to more succinctly answer your question, I would suggest that a lot of the conditions may well, in a pandemic environment, be inappropriate.
Thank you, Mr. Sparling, and thank you, Mr. Rogers. We're now going to move on to Mr. Barcelou-Duval for 2.5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My first question is for Mr. Lukacs. When the President, Mr. Stringer of the CAT of Canada, said that he didn't have the power to demand that air companies would reimburse tickets. Is that true? Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Stringer displayed a stunning ignorance about the mandate of his own organization in what he stated in his testimony. While the APPR is poorly drafted, it is not a complete code. In the past 16 years, the agency had no qualms to enforce passengers' fundamental rights to a refund. He did so, and his organization did so more precisely, based on the Canada Transportation Act and the Air Transportation Regulations, not the APPR. The Canada Transportation Act and the Air Transportation Regulations remain in effect. They have not been amended. So the law has been and remains that passengers still have a fundamental right to a refund, regardless of the reason for the cancellation of a flight.
Mr. Barcelou-Duval?
Oui, merci pour votre réponse.
Thank you for your answer. I tabled a motion to have all the correspondence between the cabinet and the Transport Canada and the CAT in order to find out whether the decisions were taken without political pressure. Do you think that this motion can be warrant of the impartiality of the decision?
Canadians are entitled to transparency. They are entitled to transparency in how a government body deals with their finances, with decisions that affect their money. The motion tabled by Mr. Boxer-Duval helps transparency and helps passengers getting an explanation as to how the Canadian Transportation Agency came to issue a misleading statement on vouchers.
Merci, Monsieur Lukacs.
Thank you. Minister Garneau.
2.5 minutes, I'm sorry. And
You're out of time.
Mr. Bachrach, floor is yours for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My first question is for Mr. Jack. Mr. Jack, you spoke a little bit about how different jurisdictions around the world have been handling this issue of refunds, and that other countries have actually done a lot better in terms of getting money back into the pockets of the air passengers who bought tickets and had their flights canceled. My question is why we've seen such a different circumstance in other jurisdictions compared to Canada. Is it a matter of there being different legislation to protect consumers in those jurisdictions, legislation that's stronger, or is it a matter of political will? That is, have other governments done a better job of getting those refunds for their citizens?
Mr. Jack?
My apologies, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the question. I think it's a bit of both. It depends on the jurisdiction. The U.S. law is clearer, leaving aside what the Canadian law actually says. That there's no doubt the American law on this point is crystal clear in terms of some refunds, at least, which were processed. In the European Union, many governments got off the mark a lot faster in terms of negotiating with their primary carriers, right? In the German example, for instance, the government did a deal with Lufthansa many months ago, and they said the same thing our Canadian government is saying now, which is as part of helping you, Lufthansa, to continue flying in the future, you must make your customers whole. The thing is, they got on with that months ago. And so it is a very good question why it has taken our government until November to make the same kind of statement. There are other jurisdictions that got on this months ago.
Mr. Bachrach?
And thank you, Mr. Chair. Maybe staying with Mr. Jack, it seems like we've heard a change in tone from the minister. When the minister first appeared, he was quite dismissive of these calls for refunds and pointed to the financial difficulties the carriers were experiencing. More recently, he's had some stronger language around the fact that he's not going to be putting together a sectoral support package until the carriers produce the refunds. Why do you think the change of tone? What has happened along the way that has caused that change in tone?
Mr. Jack?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I mean, I don't think we can speak to the minister's motivation on this. I would say that I think it's understandable that there was a lot of panic everywhere in the world, including probably in the corridors of Transport Canada for the first few weeks of this pandemic. Nobody knew what was going on. Nobody had, but we've had lots of time since to calm down and get on with this. And it is really too bad that it's taken till now December. We still don't have, I mean, they've announced they're going to do a deal. They haven't got a deal yet. We don't know when that will happen, of course. We will quite likely, quite possibly at least be moving on to a 1-year anniversary of the first people having their money disappear into an airline's coffers and not getting it back after a cancellation before we start seeing any checks issued. And of course, there's not even any certainty of that at this point. So this situation has just simply dragged on for too long.
Thank you, Mr. Jack. Thank you, Mr. Bachrach. We're now going to go on to the Conservative Party. Mr. Soroka, for 5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My first question is to Mr. Lawford. I like the idea of your creating a fund for passengers to get money from if this event happens again. But one of my big concerns, as I keep hearing from the public, is that airline tickets are expensive enough. So how much money are you thinking of that you set a small amount?
That's a good question. I don't have a study for you. I can say that in similar situations in telecommunications, monthly bills, for example, have to go up by 50 cents to cover subsidies for, say, rural telephone service. It's probably along that kind of line. You'd get a 50-cent, $1 charge, something like that per airline ticket, but I don't know. I have to admit, I haven't done the numbers. Either way, it's going to come out of airlines, which will then pass, and I'm sure, on to consumers, whether it's a new rule like from C249 or whether it's a fund.
Okay, so this is just in the concept stage, so you haven't really got any numbers or anything in that regards. Hey, Mr. Jack, you had mentioned right at the end of your past comments there about passenger reform security to make it easier for passengers to go through security. What were you talking about there?
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the question, Mr. Sorotka. We think that at some point we are going to get past this pandemic, and we will start to see air travel resume, perhaps not for some time now to the volumes it had before, but there were a series of reforms that were finally getting underway in this country to a system that hasn't really been touched in over 20 years, the airline system broadly. And all of those, of course, went into the deep freeze when COVID-19 happened. We hope that some of them are brought back, that they're not all forgotten. And one of those, in relation to CATSA, is the length of lineups that used to exist. This is obviously not an issue today because nobody's flying, but when people start flying again, we're going to start seeing very long lines again. There was a project from the government to reform CATSA significantly, to give it better funding and to allow it to invest more in technology so that we could see a better air system for Canadians. And the point of my remarks at the very end was simply to say, let's deal with this big issue of refunds first, but let's not forget about all the other things that we all cared about right before the COVID pandemic hit, and we should come back to some of those once we get past this unfortunate situation.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. That's why I wanted to ask the question, because I wasn't certain how it tied in, but now it doesn't quite tie in as well as I thought it would. To Mr. Lucas, then, the way you were implying here, it's almost like airlines were potentially selling tickets knowing that they weren't going to have those errors or the planes flying at that time. Is this true, or do you have any numbers to back this up? And if so, how much money do you think they collected in that regards?
Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. The numbers that we do have, or as I mentioned, relate to the flights for November. Airlines were, referring to Air Canada, was selling tickets, and between September 25th to October 31st, 75% of the flights of Air Canada, approximately, scheduled for November were canceled. We are seeing somewhat similar trends for WestJet. We don't have numbers for it. Those numbers that I'm referring to were also reported quite broadly by the Canadian press.
So then basically they were using this money to help fund their operations at the expense of customers?
That's quite accurate. I would actually think that this is more of a kind of pyramid game where they take the money and perhaps use that money to operate flights of previous passengers, but don't deliver services to these passengers.
So then this would easily tie right into the fact that why airlines should be compensating money back to passengers as opposed to a voucher then.
This certainly speaks to a refund. I would like to stress that compensation is not the same as refund. Compensation is for inconvenience if you don't get there on time. We are talking here about simply giving passengers back their own money that they paid for services that were never delivered.
Yeah, I can understand that. Mrs. Bellefilou, I'm probably getting your name incorrect, and I apologize for that. I've heard from people that have had trips they were in their trip, it got halfway canceled, and they'd had insurance, and yet insurance companies weren't compensating any of their trip interruption or anything like that because the airline did give them like $600 back. Is this true that as long as they got a little bit of money from an airline, the insurance companies were off the hook?
What we heard is we heard about this. The insurance consider credits as being a refund, so they refuse to refund consumers because they judge that they've already received compensation. But either way, the consumer is a loser.
We're now going to move on to the Liberals with Ms. Jazik for 5 minutes. Ms. Jazik, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for your excellent presentations. Certainly, the situation we're in now, I think we're all absolutely clear that refunds are necessary. Certainly, my constituents are telling me that very, very clearly. But we also know that pandemics have been predicted by public health officials for years. Those of us in the GTA very conscious of the SARS pandemic and, in fact, the spread through air travel. So that's a given. There will be more pandemics in the future. So I think it's really important for us as legislators to get things like the air passenger protection regulations right. Mr. Jack, I think I'd just ask you to perhaps elaborate a little bit. Is there a model from another jurisdiction that could be very helpful for Canada going forward? You mentioned the United States. Could you maybe be a little more specific as to how their regulations are worded and how they work?
Mr. Jack.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the question. Absolutely, there are several jurisdictions around the world that have a fairly clear black and white language, and none of them is perfect, I would say. The U.S., for instance, applies to domestic but not international flights. That's not so that doesn't cover everyone. There's no reason why we can't simply write this in Canada. I think Mr. Lawford had a couple of interesting suggestions the government should be considering for us going forward. We need to come up with a way to make sure that this doesn't happen again. Unfortunately, and you referenced SARS and past pandemics, we've also seen predictions that unfortunately COVID won't be the last pandemic potentially. This could happen to us again. We all hope it doesn't, but it could, and we simply need to make sure that we have proper refund provisions in place, that we close this loophole. You know, when people were looking at the legislation and then the regulations on the APPR, they were thinking, they said that, well, you know, we might have a hurricane somewhere and an airport might have to shut down for 2 days. And so it wouldn't be fair to penalize the carrier in that case because they'd be doing their best to get people home. And that's what the APPR says. Take your best efforts to get people home again. Well, we hadn't thought, nobody had thought, unfortunately, about a pandemic shutting down airspace and then people not even wanting to travel, even if the airspace is theoretically open for months and months and months. But that's the world that sadly we now live in, and we need to take care of that for the future.
Ms. Jessic.
I've heard that WestJet and Air Canada are currently actually providing some refunds. Ed Sims, the president CEO of WestJet, wrote in the Financial Post an op-ed last week and said that this was occurring. Perhaps I will ask Madame de Bellefeuille if she's aware of some of these refunds, how they're being processed. Is it really happening? Is it a good step forward? Could you just tell us your experience?
Ms. de Bellefeuille.
Madame de Bellefeuille, thank you very much for your question. I have not heard about this from WestJet consumers. I did read in the papers that WestJet did say that they were going to refund their clients, or at least a good number of their clients. We feel that this is a step in the right direction, and we're hoping that the other airlines will follow suit.
Monsieur Charbonneau, do you have any experience with these apparent refunds that are occurring?
Yes, as far as WestJet's concerned, they said that they were going to refund the airplane tickets. So we're talking about long deadlines. As far as Air Canada is concerned, the tickets that are going to be refunded are particularly the European flights, and they're so it's the Europeans who have bought tickets with Air Canada who will be refunded rather than Canadians who have bought tickets. So it's the origin of the flight that's going to be important and where they bought them.
How long do I have, Chair? You were on mute?
You have another 30 seconds.
So I would simply like to say to my colleague, Mr. Cram, it's most unfortunate you've never visited the Yukon. My daughter was there for 4 years. Air North provides an excellent service, and make sure you get there.
Thank you, Ms. Jasek, and thank you, witnesses. We're now going to move on to Mr. Shipley for 5 minutes. Mr. Shipley, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all for joining today. I think my question is going to be predominantly directed towards Mr. Lukacs, and I hope I said your last name properly. If I didn't, I apologize. But if anybody else has any more information, they can more than happy to jump in and add some. Do we know, or does anybody have information? I hear a lot about people needing refunds and tickets. Do we know? I haven't heard the number yet. I've heard how many complaints have come in and how many calls. Do we know actually the total number of customers who are still having flight tickets that haven't been refunded? What is the total number we're looking at out there?
Mr. Lukacs.
Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. We have estimates based on financial data published by those airlines that are publicly traded, and as such, they have public financial reports. Air Canada currently holds about $2.3 billion in advance ticket sales. Projected that to the entire Canadian airline sector, we estimate that about $3.87 billion are outstanding. A very conservative estimate would mean that that corresponds to about 3,870,000 passengers who are affected. The exact numbers are available only to the airlines themselves, and they should be producing that data to the committee.
Thank you for that information. That is mind-boggling. That's even more than I thought it was going to be. Now, I have just to clarify, because that's a very, very large number. That's not customers. Could that be almost divided in half because we're looking at two-way tickets?
No, that could not be divided by half, because when you do the calculation, if you look at Stats Canada data, then without taxes, an average ticket ranges between $200 and $300, depending on which year you look, which quarter you look. You also add taxes to that. So the estimate for a one-way ticket on average would be around $500 or less. So a round-trip ticket would be $1,000 or less. Then you divide 3.87 billion by 1,000, and that's how you get 3,870,000 passengers. More data is in the airline's hands, and you certainly have the power to subpoena that data in this committee.
That's a tremendous number. Would you have any idea? And again, you seem to have a lot of information, so you probably will have this. What percentage are Canadian consumers of that number of over 3 million? Do we have any idea?
We have not done that calculation. Certainly, one would have to be very careful to do the proper calculation, because you have some statistics on per segment flown, per embarkments. The best source for getting any information would be to ask the airlines themselves to open their books and provide that information at least to this committee. If the airlines are asking for money for the public purse, they have to open their books.
Okay, thank you for that information. The number is a little more mind-boggling than I even thought, but it's good information to have. You also mentioned earlier about, and this perplexed me, that airlines are still selling tickets only to cancel flights. There was an incident actually here. I drive because I'm nearby enough, but a lot of my colleagues 2 weeks ago on a Thursday all had their plans, airlines booked. They almost all got the text, email at the same time indicating this was a Thursday, that their 4 o'clock flight out of Ottawa on Friday was canceled due to bad weather. Everybody looked at the weather. There was no bad weather scheduled. It really sent a lot of people scrambling to try and get home all over Canada. But no one could figure out exactly what was going on. But again, that was a Thursday night. The email text went to everybody almost at the same time, indicating that weather had canceled their flight. Is this the type of thing you're talking about, Mr. Lukacs?
So, Chair, we are seeing a number of instances where airlines make dubious claims about the reasons for flight cancellations. The reason is that if the cancellation is within the airline's control, then on top of refunds, airlines also have to compensate passengers for the inconvenience. So because of how poorly the APPR is worded and how it has been built, airlines have a significant financial incentive to not be entirely forthright about the reason for the flight cancellation. We have also seen airlines blame the pandemic for flight cancellations, even though it happened a long time in advance. It was clearly a business decision. So there are concerns about transparency, and certainly with the numbers, with the current financial data and interest in travel, it would be predictable that only a fraction of those flights would operate.
Thank you, Mr. Lucas. Thank you, Mr. Shipley.
Thank you, Chair.
We're now going to move on to the Liberal Party with Mr. Sidhu for 5 minutes. Mr. Sidhu, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being with us today and providing some valuable insights. My first question is to Mr. Jack. The minister has already stated assistance to the airlines would be conditional on them reimbursing their customers. I've got many constituents that reached out to me regarding their concerns and in regards to their refunds. What more would you add to that? Would you seek additional conditions to that?
Mr. Chair, thank you and thank the member for the question. Do you mean additional conditions on the refunds or on the carriers?
Just additional conditions on the carriers for them to reimburse. We are going to use tax funded dollars, so we want to be responsible as well.
Yes, sorry. Thank you for the clarification. I appreciate it. Well, just today we've had one of the carriers announce that they're pulling out of a couple of small markets. Perhaps that's part of their negotiation strategy right now. I'm not sure, but if I were members of the committee, if I were the government, I would want to make sure that service is restored, that there are minimal service guarantees across this country, because of course the aviation sector binds us. We have from Air North somebody who has said repeatedly and quite truthfully that people need to travel in the north, that people need to travel from communities across this country. Some travel is a nice to have, but some of it is a must have. And so we do need to make sure that those services are there. I would note that, the carriers have taken slightly different positions on this. We have heard that WestJet is refunding. In their case, they're refunding for flights that they canceled, not for flights that passengers canceled out of an abundance of caution in the spring. I myself canceled 2 flights in early to mid-March because I thought, well, there's no way I'm going anywhere in April or May. Those are business flights. I'm not out of pocket myself, so I'm not complaining about my own finances, but I'm observing that an awful lot of people would have done that. And that's why I think that overall it's important that we don't differentiate between whether people canceled flights themselves during the height of the pandemic or whether they were canceled on them by the carriers.
Thank you for that. And Mr. Lawford, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, I have some thoughts about bailouts in particular rather than conditions around the tickets. We've advocated for bailout money to make sure that none of that goes to shareholders. So it's no dividends extra paid out of that money, share buybacks, executive compensation or bonus to try to keep all the labor that they presently have so that there are not layoffs when they're receiving bailout monies. And of course, consumer refunds in this particular situation. So those are extra conditions I'm speaking about in terms of bailouts rather than ticket conditions.
Thank you for that. Mr. Sparling, I want to thank you for being here. Regional connectivity is very, very important. It's not just about the connectivity, it's about learning about each other's cultures. Canada is a vast country, and we need to ensure that we're able to travel. I've never been to the Yukon. I hope to come one day. So my question to you is, how much assistance have you received so far between the wage subsidy and financial assistance from the federal government through Yukon?
Through the end of September, we're just over $7 million between the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy and the Northern Essential Air Services Program. The majority of it is the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy funding, but the Yukon government, in conjunction with the federal government, have a program for essential air services in the north, which we've certainly taken advantage of and are very thankful for.
Thank you for that. And is there anything else you'd like to add? I noticed you're not getting that much speaking time, but I'm very intrigued. Is there any other issues you want to bring up or anything you'd like to add in terms of comments?
1 minute.
I think you've hopefully I covered everything in the notes. I think one of the things I tried to point out is I learned a lot when I was researching, just how many or few communities in the whole country actually have scheduled air service, and the fact that the majority of them are communities of under 10,000 people. The notion of interline agreements, a lot of our regional communities are not accessible to the rest of Canada in the absence of simple interline agreements between air carriers that will show a passenger, for example, wanting to go from Toronto to Dawson City, that it's possible to fly there. Because in the absence of an interline agreement between ourselves and Air Canada, the Dawson as a destination doesn't show up. Another example would be a passenger that flies from Old Crow to Toronto and misconnects in Vancouver with an Air Canada or WestJet flight. They could conceivably be asked to buy a new ticket because there is no interline agreement between the two carriers. I think as a nation, if our goal is to truly link every community in the country together, then we should be making the airlines mandated to link themselves together so passengers can check their bags, so that passengers can be protected when transiting from one carrier to another. This should not be a competitive tool that big airline can use against small airlines. So I think that's a key point to think about.
Thank you, Mr. Sparling, and thank you, Mr. Sidhu. I'm now going to move on for 2.5 minutes to Mr. Brassou-Duval of the Bloc Québécois. Mr. Brassou-Duval, the floor is now yours.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My next question is for Mr. Charbonneau. Since the beginning of the pandemic, you said that all over the world, in the European Union or United States, people were clear and saying that passengers are due, reimbursement is due to the passenger. But here we see a diminution of the reimbursement. Marc Garneau, the Minister of Transportation, never actually said that passengers should be reimbursed, have a right to be reimbursed. And right now what he says is perhaps passengers should be reimbursed if there is a financial support from the government. But he doesn't defend the right to defend the passengers to be reimbursed. What do you think of Canada as in the whole global universe? Well, it seems that in Canada, at the political level, they are for the carrier rather than the passenger. Well, this happened in the beginning of the crisis for other countries, and also in the way we put together a rule to protect consumer, but it should protect consumer. And when you see the number of complaints that were created last year, we are talking about 22,000 complaints, and half of them were before the crisis. That is 3 months after this rule being enforced. So if you have a rule that is called protecting consumer, well, you could perhaps wonder of how this rule is applied. And if we can put it on pause when people need it, then it's really not a good thing. Thank you for your answer. I have another question because we're discussing Air Canada buying Air Transat. We see that passengers, once again, are not really well treated. Could there be even less competition in the air transportation sector in Canada? Would that be worse for passenger? Well, sure, it could be quite problematic because it seems like you give the keys to the kingdom to one company, a company that is often named, but not for the good reason, for complaints on the linguistic level and also for services. And you put the industry at risk because if there's less competition, there are less actors in the value chain. And because they want to obtain discounts, and then there is less competition. So, well, the value chain is critical. So as soon as there's a problem with one, it affects the whole industry. If there is a computer break, well, it affects the whole industry. So the less competition and more the industry is at risk. And it's also the case for the other stakeholder, like a travel agent. If you can't choose among provider, then it's not the same. And for passenger, if you have the choice between Air Canada and Air Canada, well, you'll probably use a company from outside Canada because you don't have enough choice in Canada. And it could reduce market share for Canadian companies.
Well, we'll now move on to the NDP. Mr. Bachrach, you have 2.5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question for Mr. Lucas again. We've heard, and just in the recent questions, we heard about the 11,000 complaints that the CTA received from passengers even before the pandemic, and then a further 11,000 complaints after, or 11,000 claims. I'm wondering what you think the issues are that are preventing these complaints from being resolved in a timely way, and what are these delays? What impact are these delays having on the ability of air passengers to assert their consumer rights in Canada?
Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. What is missing first and foremost for dealing with those complaints is will by the Canadian Transportation Agency to address them. Documents that we have indicate that the Canadian Transportation Agency has been sending away passengers with valid complaints, telling them that they have no case. We don't know the full extent of that because we haven't received all the documents under access to information yet. The issue of refunds, which seems to be the primary source of the recent batch of complaints, could have been dealt very swiftly and in a very simple way in a single proceeding for each airline. Precedent for that exists from the Sky Greece saga from 2015, when the agency issued a single decision to deal with all issues relating to passengers who were stranded. So it does not take months or years to deal with some of those issues. It just takes will to address it.
Okay, Mr. Lucas, you mentioned before that you feel that the current legislation and the current regulations are actually strong enough to require these refunds, but you've also mentioned that you believe that changes could be made to increase their clarity and to protect consumer rights. Could you identify specifically what changes you think need to be made to the APPR to ensure passengers are never left exposed like this again?
Thank you for the question. First of all, I believe that passenger rights should be incorporated in primary legislation, not in regulations. Regulations the agency can suspend and did suspend at the whim. Second, even before the APPR, passengers had a right to a refund when the airline canceled a flight for any reason. That hasn't changed. It could be incorporated and should be incorporated in the APPR simply to have a single document that lists all those rights. The other major issue of concern is the issues relating to who has the burden of proof when a flight is canceled or delayed, whether it was within the airline's control or not. And this whole idea that if a flight was canceled or delayed for maintenance reasons, then the airline is off the hook. That is something that's inconsistent with international standards. Canada should generally adopt the European Union's gold standard. In the European Union, there are no such issues with refunds. The European Union made it clear to all states that they have to enforce the rights of passengers to a refund, which is clearly enshrined in the European regulations.
Okay, maybe my last question. Just
actually, Mr. Bachrach, time's up. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I'm bang on time here, so I'm trying to keep it disciplined. So my apologies, and thank you for the questions as well, Mr. Lucas. Thank you for the questions. I'm now going to go to the Conservatives. Ms. Cusi, you got 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Sparling, I was hoping that you might be able to provide some insight as to what a lack of rapid testing has meant for regional service in the North specifically, if and how that's affected air travel in the North.
Well, to the extent that rapid testing would eliminate the need for mandatory self-isolation, then it's had a major impact. As you may or may not know, anybody now coming into the Yukon from outside the territory must self-isolate for 2 weeks. And that we had a travel bubble with BC starting in July. And when the travel bubble opened in July, we saw a pretty significant uptick in traffic. And I thought we were on the mend, clearly on the mend in terms of the COVID impact. But late November, due to the rising infections in BC, the government reimposed the travel bubble, and traffic dropped like a rock. So with rapid testing, if we were able to then let people travel more freely, it would make a significant difference. And we're certainly in discussions with the Yukon government about that possibility. But to date, we're still, the border's closed, so it's having a major impact, and we're looking for something to get things going again.
Ms. Cusi.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to move now to air cargo. I'm wondering what it means in terms of the significance of being able to move cargo freely to and from the Yukon at this time, and if there have been difficulties or changes in cargo patterns as a result of the pandemic.
No, our cargo volumes are the one thing that have been stable as a result of the pandemic. Passenger volumes, we were down 95% in April. We've recovered to being down 60% or so. Cargo volumes have remained relatively stable throughout the pandemic. We're very thankful for that.
Okay, and so so it's significant, and there's been no difficulty. I'll go back to Dr. Lucas then. If Dr. Lucas, could you please expand upon the changes that you would like to see within the current legislation, which I believe was proposed by my predecessor, MP Doherty? Can you explain that clearly for the committee? What this legislation would incur exactly?
Mr. Chair, thank you for the member's question. Currently, there's a private member's bill by Mr. Boxer-Duval, Bill C-249, which has been tabled earlier. I understand that your predecessor may also be working on something similar. The effect of this bill is that it would declare that the law has always been that passengers are entitled to a refund when the airline cancels a flight for any reason, whether within or outside the airline's control. The one change that I would like to see in the bill is, instead of having this bill as a declaratory in its summary, to move it into the actual text of the statute to avoid any doubt. What we have seen now is that airlines will try to use every excuse to not pay passengers. By making clear that this bill is declaratory, it is going to settle once and for all this debate to ensure that it is clear for everyone that the law has always been that when an airline cancels a flight for any reason and doesn't provide passengers with a service passengers had paid for, passengers have to get that money back.
40 seconds, Ms. Cusi.
Thank you very much. I'll finish then with the question that I had earlier for our colleague, Mr. Lawford. Dr. Lucas, what effect do you think this will have on consumer confidence in the future? We've heard some testimony today that there was some increased confidence in consumers based upon the passenger right legislation. Do you think that has been eroded as a result of this situation of the pandemic?
Mr. Lawford.
I believe, was that directed to Mr. Lucas?
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
Pardon. Sorry, Mr. Lawford. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The air passenger protection regulations created a false sense of confidence. They never were meant to work. They were designed to fail. And certainly what we see now undermines further passengers and consumers' confidence. Bill C-249 is going to just fix the basics. the most important principle in every commercial transaction, that if you don't receive what you paid for, you get back your money. It is a vital step for the entire sector's recovery.
Thank you, Mr. Lucas, and Ms. Kusi, thank you.
Thank you.
I'm now going to move on to our last speaker for 5 minutes for the Liberals, Mr. Biddle. Mr. Biddle, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. My first question is to Mr. Lawford. My understanding is that the CTA's voucher statement in March was not a binding decision and did not change the law, but provided guidance as to a reasonable approach given the extraordinary circumstances. I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Mr. Lawford.
Thank you. Yes, I suppose the CTA thought it was a reasonable response in the panic moment. However, that was a policy statement that they should have known what was going to affect consumers' will and understanding of the situation. So my concern with it is it implied, at least at a consumer understanding level, that refunds would not be forthcoming and that consumers should just sit tight and be happy for their 2-year vouchers. I think that the CTA did not take into account consumer perception of what they were trying to do, which was just give a temporary circuit break until they could get to these complaints. And I would have been much happier if they had described it that way, but they left it out there, making it sound with no context like that was all consumers were ever going to get and that's all they were entitled to. And I think that that's the concern that Dr. Lukash also mentioned.
Point's a little low.
Mr. Biddle.
Thank you very much. And I was wondering if you could comment on, and perhaps this is venturing into hypotheticals, and I know there's some dispute as to the situation the airlines find themselves in. But what would the status of a consumer be if if an airline or airlines entered into bankruptcy or creditor protection? What would that, as an unsecured creditor, what would their rights be under the law?
As I think Metro de Beltoy said, they would likely be unsecured creditors at the very bottom of the heap. And if the company came to an arrangement to hand out, say, 17 cents on the dollar, they would get their portion after secured creditors took that 17 cents, and I'm sure their claims would be larger than that. So probably nothing. I understand that the concern might be that if there are refunds offered, some airlines may become financially unstable, and then that will happen, and there'll be a knock-on effect. But my understanding is that there's a bailout package being negotiated without consumers in the room, I might add. So if that's the case, then I think it's eminently reasonable to ask for refunds, especially if taxpayers are already going to be making sure that no one goes bankrupt.
Thank you, Mr. Lawford, and I'll throw this question to you as well, but I'll open it up to whomever wants to answer. But how concerned do you think the government should be about Canada losing connectivity for a long time, both domestically and internationally, as a result of this crisis?
That's the million-dollar question. It certainly, I believe that Air Canada is large enough and strong enough, and probably WestJet as well, to weather at least another year of this. Other smaller airlines such as Air Transat may be in a different position, and I think that that's the minister's job to monitor that situation closely and to come up with a new policy if needed. That's all I can say. Thank you.
Mr. Biddle.
Any other witness that would like to answer that question?
I'm happy to comment on that.
Go ahead, Mr. Lukacs.
Mr. Chair, for the short term, people should be staying at home because they're the safest thing under the pandemic. Once the pandemic is over, demand is going to be back. And if consumer confidence is restored, demand is going to be back and connectivity will be back. Those things are all tied together. One cannot deal with one, but not the other.
Mr. Biddle.
I guess not to pick. If Mr. Jack, would you like to comment on that question?
Mr. Jack.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with Mr. Lukash on that. We have to deal with both of these things. We do have negotiations underway with the carriers to ensure that they're policy and financial needs allow them to carry on. We need to get consumer confidence back up. I think a number of us have observed that there are economic as well as cultural and social benefits from having a viable airline industry in this country. We need to ensure that, but we need to make sure that consumers are not the ones funding this because they paid for a service they never received, and then the airlines made off with their money.
And Mr. Sparling, I was wondering if you can comment as a industry representative on that in terms of the future of the industry and your airline.
Well, yes, you spoke of international carriers. They've been hardest hit, and I think as a country, we need to do all that we can to make sure that our carriers that fly internationally are protected and able to compete with foreign air carriers who are often funded by their governments. And, that means doing all that we can to drive business, that is, people that are traveling internationally onto Canadian carriers, and doing all that we can to make the cost structure of our Canadian air carriers competitive with those of other countries who are, sometimes subsidizing their airlines. And that might be such things as perhaps taking over, at least temporarily, some of the infrastructure costs that Canadian carriers are bearing, the excise tax on fuel, the NAV fees, airport fees, things like that will make the cost structure of Canadian air carriers more in line with those of foreign air carriers. I think that vis-a-vis the Americans, generally speaking, a U.S. carrier has about a 20% cost advantage over a Canadian carrier. And I think we could do a lot to help our industry if we were to level the playing field a little bit in that regard.
Thank you, Mr. Sparling. Thank you, Mr. Biddle. And thank you to all the witnesses. And of course, all the questions that came from all parties. I think one of the satisfying parts of today's meeting wasn't that we just talked about the airlines, but we also talked about the supply chain, including the travel agents and others that are affected by the pandemic, and of course, a lot of the challenges that we've been facing for the past year. So with that, once again, I want to thank all the witnesses. Thank you for your time. To the members, great questions. And with that, I will now adjourn this meeting. Good night.